Uh, so with that, I want to give everybody a very warm welcome. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides, bienvenidex. We're so pleased to welcome you all to this event, just titled Translation as Feminist Collaboration, a conversation with Cristina Rivera Garza, Lauren Hook, and Sarah Booker. I want to get started by saying some thank yous to the different organizations and people who made this event possible. So the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the Duke University Consortium for Latin American Studies, Latin American Caribbean Studies, excuse me. The other members of the Working Group for Gender and Sexuality Studies in Latin America and the Caribbean, which I'm a part, which has organized this event, the UNC Department of Romance Studies, the Duke Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, and the Duke Department of Cultural Anthropology. So thank you to all the people and organizations, again, involved in that collaboration to make this event possible. And so the event tonight has many different parts to it. I think it's going to be a really dynamic and exciting conversation with readings, with prepared remarks, and with a chance for audience discussion at the end. We're going to start with some prepared remarks from our three speakers who are first going to be introduced. And then after that, there's going to be a reading I'm very excited about of the original Spanish text by Cristina Rivera Garza, followed by Sarah Booker's translation. It'll be in Spanish first and then in English. And then we'll have a sort of moderated conversation with some prepared questions that you all have sent in when you registered. And then finally, we'll have some time for questions that arise from you all, from the audience. And I would like to remind everybody, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself while you're not speaking, will help cut down on any kind of static or noise interference. And I also am excited to pass the microphone now to Emily Taylor, who's another member of the working group, to make an announcement about an upcoming event we have next week.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So good to see everyone here tonight. I'm a co-organizer of the Gender and Sexuality in Latin America Working Group. And 2 weeks from now, on Thursday evening, February 4th, we're hosting another virtual event. It's called Fieldwork in Times of Crisis, and we'll be hosting Dr. Virginia Gerard from the University of Texas at Austin. She'll be talking about her fieldwork, her experiences doing fieldwork in Guatemala during the internal conflict. And then we will pivot the event and have it be more of a open discussion about various challenges we can face in times of crisis doing fieldwork, both within the context of COVID and more broadly. I'm going to put the link in the chat to RSVP to a similar form like you guys did. So I hope to see you guys there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emily. Great. So now I'm going to hand the microphone to Professor Oswaldo Estrada, who's a professor in the Department of Romance Studies at UNC, to introduce Cristina Rivera Garza.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you tonight. Cristina and I go way back, and we've been collaborating on a series of presentations lately. So I'm trying to think to come up with something new, Cristina, to introduce to you. Yesterday, I mentioned at a different presentation in celebration of her Macarthur Fellowship that I met her probably right after the publication of one of her two novels. It was either Lo Anterior or La Cresta de León. I can't remember now. But shortly after that, we became really good friends. And there are times that I've come to cherish over time. For instance, the time that we drove, I don't know if you'll remember this, Cristina, from Santa Barbara to San Diego with the Pacific Ocean on the right side. And we had like this awesome conversation. Or the time we shared a bus ride in Mérida, and we talked about the very recent translation of your first novel. And we were talking about how wonderful it would be to have La Cresta de León translated into English at some point. And then, of course, Sarah Booker, a few years later, ended up translating that novel and other stuff like what we'll be discussing today. And one more thing, on the day that I was getting married in Spain, Cristina managed to send her illustrator to my wedding with a little with a set of postcards that he had painted just for us. So our connections are very genuine, and we've known each other for a long time. She's an award-winning author of several novels, collections of short stories, collections of poetry, and nonfiction books, originally written in Spanish. Some of these works have been translated into multiple languages, including English, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Korean. She has received many awards, such as the Premio Nacional de Novela José Rubén Romero, the Premio Nacional de Cuento Juan Vicente Melo, the Roger Calois Award for Latin American Literature, and the Anna Sagers. She is, in fact, the only author who has won the International Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Prize twice, in 2001 for her novel Nadie me verá llorar, translated into English as No One Will See Me Cry, and again in 2009 for her novel La Muerte Me Da. She was the Breeden Eminent Scholar at Auburn University in the fall of 2015, and a fellow at the University of California, San Diego Center for Humanities in 2015-2016. She received a Senate grant from UCSD and the prestigious 3-year Sistema Nacional de Creadores grant from Mexico. A true border crosser, Rivera Garza observes the agony of those who come to this country, of those who stay behind, the conflicts that take place when the first language encounters a second language of adoption, and what it means to write in Spanish in the US. I admire her deeply because her chronicles and essays and novels validate otherness and marginality, the fluidity of borders, hybrid identities, dissident sexualities, and promote in so many ways the creation of contestatory tales of resistance and empowerment. Bienvenida, Cristina.
Thank you so much, Osvaldo. And now I'll have Sarah Blanton, who's a graduate student in the Department of Romance Studies at UNC, to introduce Lauren Hook.
Thank you so much, and I am just thrilled to be with all of you, and I'm excited for this discussion. And I have the true pleasure of introducing Lauren Hook, who currently serves as the interim director and publisher at the Feminist Press, where she also manages foreign rights and overseas production. So she joined the press in 2014, and her work has consistently reflected her dedication to acquiring international feminist works in translation. This commitment is in line also with the mission of the press, which since 1970 has been, and I quote, to publish marginalized voices and authors writing about issues of equality and gender identity. Hook edited both Grieving and the Iliac Crest by our esteemed Cristina Rivera Garza and translated by Sarah Booker, along with many other critically acclaimed texts from places such as Equatorial Guinea, Poland, Thailand, Bosnia, and Croatia. According to the Feminist Press website, as an editor, Hook seeks to acquire intersectional, nuanced books that inspire and further feminist discourse. She's a graduate from the University of Georgia, where she studied Spanish, Latin American, Caribbean studies, and international affairs. And we are just thrilled that you're joining us today and are looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And then it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Sarah Booker, the third panelist tonight. Sarah is a graduate student also in the Department of Romance Studies, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a miraculously accomplished translator for someone who's more or less my age. She's a translator working from Spanish and Portuguese to English, and has published translations by Cristina Rivera Garza and by Monica Ojeda, among others, in publications such as Latin American Literature Today, Paris Review, and Asymptote. She's also translated academic texts, and she's currently organizing the Carolina Translation Collective, founded in 2017, with Sarah Blanton. And just learned today, excitingly forthcoming, is a new work, Selected New Stories, a collection of short stories published by Dorothy Press by Cristina Rivera Garza that Sarah Booker has translated, coming out in October. And so again, a very warm welcome to everybody who's participating, and especially a heartfelt thank you to our speakers. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Cristina Rivera Garza to provide some prepared remarks, and then Sarah will speak, and then Lauren, sort of the process, writer, translator, and editor, in that order.
All right.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for organizing this event. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk to Sarah. I don't get to talk a lot, very frequently with Lauren, but every time that we've met, it's been just fantastic and enriching, and I'm looking forward to our interaction today too. So, I've been so happy with what Lauren has done in Feminist Press and what three of us have achieved there. Well, you'll see. I'm absolutely grateful and delighted. So I'm just going to share a couple of ideas with you before we get into the reading and the conversation. I've always believed that in writing, I'm writing with others. I've been very suspicious of descriptions of writing as a solitary practice, as something that one person does on his or her own. On the contrary, I do believe that just by virtue of using language, we are always writing with someone else, because language comes to us, or we come to language as a force informed by the experiences of many, by the experiences specifically of the practitioners of that language. So I do believe that translation makes this relationship very obvious, inescapable, in fact. It is not only that translation is a writing practice that is always involving at least two components, making it a plural practice to begin with. I do believe that that's what I do when I'm writing. In a way, I'm in the constant process of translating material, getting that material through me, my body, the way in which I interpret the world, but always in relationship to that already charged, politically charged material as well. So translation allows us to see something that to me is intrinsic to the process of writing. And it also allows us to see in what way authors, in fact, are usually more often than not co-authors. What we are reading is the kind of text. Whatever text we're reading is a text that is being produced by this constant, dynamic, at times volatile relationship between a plurality of writers or versions. The result of that, in my view, are versions rather than translations. So in many ways, I consider the work that Sarah and I have been doing for now some years, the work of producing versions of my own work. I consider Sarah to be my co-author in the way in which these texts appear now in English. I have to say, before I continue, I have to say that Sarah has done more than reading carefully, reading in between the lines, grappling with, the challenges of moving meaning from one language to the other. Sarah has done what many translators do. In fact, he became at the very in the earlier stages of our relationship, Sarah became kind of like an agent, just bringing my work to several readers, and in such a way that eventually she was the one who got the attention, Lauren's attention about this work. So she had already read the work. We had already talked about it. I didn't have any plans or specific projects in terms of translation possibilities. And Sarah is just full of energy, savviness, enthusiasm, passion. She did all these, and I am, as you can imagine, tremendously grateful for all of that. By the way, and this might be kind of weird, Sarah and I have never met in person. We've been corresponding. We've had many Zoom meetings. We WhatsApp at the slightest provocation. We talk on the phone, but we have yet to be, both of us, both of our bodies in the same place. And hopefully after this COVID nightmare is over and we're still alive, hopefully we'll get to be in the same place together. I'm really looking forward to that. But what we've done, I think, is we created a relationship, and one that is very horizontal. Sarah, this is deeply collaborative. This is collaborative work, and this is a work in which Sarah very often, you know, she starts with the translation. She poses questions. I try to answer in the best way I can. She's suggesting alternatives. If she has some, you know, trouble, or if she's running into some specific challenge, we develop a conversation about that. Usually these things are now, we go rather fast through all these processes, but obviously we've been working in this way for so many years. So that relationship, the horizontal way in which we work, the way in which collaboration is emphasized and is central to what we do, that to me is an example of feminist ethics. This is not the case of a text over which I claim sole ownership, and or a text over which I claim the only single hierarchical interpretation, but rather the case of a text that is open to the view, to the work, the interpretation, and the experience that both of us bring to the whole process. And that to me is central to what we might call a feminist work ethic as well. So many of the topics that I've been working on over the years are gender related. I'm very much interested in creating and working critically with language so that we can approach gender relationships and gender hierarchies with critical eyes. And so in terms of the topics and the themes, of course, these lend themselves very, very nicely to the kind of work that the Feminist Press has been paying attention to for a number of years now. But I think beyond that, beyond the issue of the topic or the theme that the work is trying to grapple with, I think at the core of this whole process, that give and take, that respect that we have developed for each other, and the way that I truly see us as co-workers with language. So I would leave that. That would be to me the seal of our or at least my feminist view in the whole thing. Finally, I have to say that my work with Sarah over a number of years now has very much reshaped the way in which I write, when I write on my own, when I write without her, right? I've been, as you know, living in this country for a number of years. I've been writing mostly in Spanish, although at times I've been writing in English, not publishing in English, but writing some of this work in English. But now, after I've been so enriched by the translation process, then now what I do is that every time that I'm writing something originally in one language, in order for me to be able to revise that text or those texts, I tried to go through the same process of creation, as you might term it. I try to write it again. I rewrite it, but in the other language. And so there are questions that emerge so clearly in a language that are not necessarily as easily seen in a previous or the other language. And in any case, doing this continuously of course, makes the work very, very slowly. I advance it at a very slow pace. But in exchange, what I get is a deeper understanding of the forces that I'm working with. As you may know, I think that as a writer, I have a certain idea of the topics, of the terrains, of the main questions that I'm interested in, but I write because I don't know the answer. So writing is a process of getting to explore to the fullest of my capacities the issues and topics and enigmas that I'm only half aware of. So going through these inner practice of translation, a translation within my own process of writing has really clarified aspects of my own writing, aspects of my own writing as I'm trying to uncover what my writing is about, that it would take me years otherwise. So in a way, I continue writing with Sarah, even though Sarah is not necessarily present. And in any case, I hope that we get to work in the future in such an enriching and a wonderful way as we've done so far. So that will be the main ideas, and then I'll be happy to join the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cristina. I'm sure there'll be time for ample applause at the end. That's wonderful. And now I'll pass the mic to Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for organizing this, Joe and Emily, and thank you to Cristina and Lauren and Osvaldo and Sarah for joining us, and for those kind words, Cristina. I loved what you said about translation and collaboration as a sort of feminist approach to writing, and that's what you said about revisions and kind of like constantly returning to your ideas is one of the things that I love most about your writing, and the ways that you kind of constantly returning to different ideas and images across your works. And I've been incredibly appreciative for all the generous collaboration from both Cristina and Lauren. I feel very lucky to have kind of gotten into translation this way. So I guess in just a few minutes, I'm gonna speak here with these remarks. I just wanted to maybe sort of give a little bit more practical comment on sort of my translation path so far, and the path into working on Grieving. So I guess I'll start with kind of the beginning of how I got interested in translation. I hear a lot of translators when they speak about their translation origin story, I guess. I think there's a lot of translators who talk about it as falling into translation by accident. At some point they were in some situation in which somebody asked them to do a translation, and they kind of discovered it that way. And I think I love hearing those stories, but it has not really been my story, I don't think. I know. So I first got interested in translation. I remember studying abroad in Argentina my sophomore year of college and looking at what classes I was going to enroll in, and when I got back, and I saw there was a translation class in the Spanish department, and I remember thinking, oh, that sounds interesting. I think actually I saw Grace Aaron is here and taught that class. I remember just thinking that, like, oh wow, that sounds like such a great way to put my language skills to use and to kind of really start practicing with this. I remember talking to another student on my study abroad program and telling him about this class, and he just seemed shocked of, like, that seemed like the least interesting thing to him, that it seemed very tedious. But so I took that class and I loved it. I took couple more translation classes, and then really tried to pursue translation. Spent some time in Spain in the hopes to, like, strengthen my language skills, and continue kind of practicing with translation, looking for writers, trying to get a feel for who was writing and what kinds of writing I was interested in. And I think I was initially drawn to translation for a number of reasons, in large part for the opportunity to participate in this writing that I love so much and this writing that I admired, both in Spanish and in English. I think translation is a way to kind of take part in a dialogue, to read deeply and then to contribute or to talk back, to speak with that writing. I also found it a really an intimate and creative way to use language that I found like very energizing and empowering. I know we had a talk yesterday with Karen Emmerich, and she talked about this as well. But I was also drawn to translation because it's an opportunity to play with a piece of writing without having to worry about the story and the plot and the character development. As an opportunity to really focus on the level of language that I've always really liked. And it's also a form of really deep reading that I find very valuable. And I've tried to, I guess, pay attention to the fact that I'm in a position to make certain voices available. I am in a privileged position here working within English and working within the academy that I am in a position to make certain voices available and try to be careful about the kinds of translations that I do and the kinds of writers that I work with. And I do very deeply believe in the importance of translation and its ability to disrupt borders, disrupt conventional knowledge and approaches. Yeah, so I decided to pursue a PhD in Spanish, in part to develop my understanding of the literary landscape in Latin American literature. And in part, it was also a strategic decision to kind of give myself multiple options of what I could do, get training in multiple things, teaching and research and translation, and then to find ways for those three different practices to inform and enrich each other, which I've felt like I've had lots of opportunities to do. In terms of my literary interests, I'm particularly drawn to writing that experiments or pushes against expectations, and generally writing by women. I was particularly drawn to Cristina's writing for all of this and for the way that it sort of causes this unstable reading experience. And I think I was first drawn to the writing because I did not fully understand it necessarily. And translation became kind of a way to get into what she was writing and to understand it. And I felt like, we use a geological term because Cristina frequently uses these geological terms, but it felt like a process of excavation to translate, to look at all the different layers that are involved in a text and how it's put together and how the language is working and how different parts of the text are working together, and then how a single text is working across multiple bodies of texts in different collections. So I first came to working with Cristina because of Osvaldo. Early on, I think I was trying to decide which program to go to, and Osvaldo suggested that if I came to UNC, that he might be able to help me out and put me in touch with Cristina. And for a while, we were talking about doing a co-translation of the Iliad Crest. And then life happens, and I ended up taking the lead on that project. I think I did a couple short stories first to kind of start to get a feel for Cristina's writing, and then started working on the Iliad Crest. And I did a sample, and then I didn't really know many people in the translation world, and I just sent out cover letter and a sample to a lot of editors, and I really lucked out with Lauren being interested in it. And that's just been an amazing relationship since then. So we worked on the Iliad Crest, and that was published in 2017. And then pretty soon after that, Cristina and I were talking about what project to do next. I think we were thinking about doing another novel. And Cristina, you're the one that suggested Grieving as the next project, or Dolerse in Spanish. And this was back late 2017, early 2018. This was pretty early in the Trump presidency. And I think this was a time when it was such a hard time in this country, and that violence and racism and sexism were so prominent everywhere. that we thought Grieving, which speaks to and about a different historical and political context, but it felt relevant for the contemporary, for that context, for that time. And it felt like a book that kind of spoke to this poetics of collective grieving and collective healing would be particularly meaningful. The last thing I wanted to say about this, and Lauren, you might mention it as well, but the translation process for that was interesting, and sort of the ways that the world changed while we were working on it. So I think I was doing most of the translation, I think, during the summer of 2019, but then we really got into the deep editing part of that right at the beginning of the pandemic, which was just a totally different but equally challenging context. And it's been interesting to see how the text itself relates to and changes with the changing changing context. So I think I will stop there, and I'll hand it over to Lauren.
Thanks so much, everyone, for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and to be in conversation with Cristina and Sarah. These two books are just such incredible stories. And so I'm so excited for everyone to hear more about the process and everything. Cristina, I loved what you were saying about having this feminist work ethic and this sort of horizontal collaborative relationship between you and Sarah. At Feminist Press, we're a nonprofit publisher. We turned 50 last year, so starting our 51st year this year. And we're always thinking about how we show up in the workplace. What does it mean to be a feminist publisher, especially 1970 versus now, especially like you said, Sarah, during the Trump presidency. And we're always thinking about, that is also like our operations, how we treat each other, what kinds of books we acquire, every aspect of our operations. And so I think for us, we also really strive for this more horizontal collaborative relationship with authors, whether it's, choosing that cover design, that title, to like edits these conversations. We never want to, be that red stamp and be like, this is how it is, hope you like it, and you're holding your book and you're like, God, I hate this cover. We really want to have these conversations so that an author sees their book in the world and they actually recognize themselves in the project rather than having it be hijacked or misunderstood or marketed in a way that was, just like icky or inaccurate. And I think also, in these 50 years, global feminisms has always been a part of our mission. Our founder always believed in bringing texts from all around the world and nonfiction and fiction poetry and translating them and really thinking about how that can move the feminist conversation forward here. And I think I really can't think of better examples, some of my coworkers are here, of our translations epitomizing this idea than the Iliad Crest and Grieving, specifically this feminism as collaboration. I'm just thinking about how the books came together and then how we worked together, the three of us. And with Iliad Crest, this really stuck with me. I remember, Cristina, when you were going back through the draft after, I'd taken a crack at it and you were kind of doing a last pass. We were like, well, this is 10 years after the fact. This is a different audience. How are you feeling about the text? Do you want to expand a section? And you went in and you made some changes. You fleshed out some passages, you tweaked some things. And then our edition comes out in English. And then lo and behold, there's now a Spanish edition in the world with those edits retranslated back into Spanish. How cool is that? And I think Grieving is even more of an innovative project and also pushes what we think about when we think of translation, because it's not, for anyone who hasn't read the book, pick it up. It is not a straight up essay collection. We have poetry, reportage, personal essays, and they're written over a decade, maybe 15 years. We have really new pieces. We have pieces written in English. And then we also have, the majority of the book is from Delerce, which came out in 2011, I believe, in Spanish. Fact check me. And so we have this really amazing experience of a decade later, in a new country, in a country where politically things are really hot. We have a lot of conversations going. And Sarah, I know you're going to remember reading these essays. Number one, I'm in my Queens apartment where I was editing this book in March and April, feeling so isolated. And Cristina, reading your essays about how disillusioned you were with the Black squares on social media as a form of activism, but that was a piece from 6 years in the past. Or reading your piece about H1N1, and here we were in another pandemic. There were so many things that I was seeing in this book that resonated with me as a reader in 2020 at the time. It was fascinating. I felt in a complete like time-space continuum. I was just like, this book is so amazing. And to see how it started and then how it grew and how the pandemic even shaped those conversations. Cristina, you were writing new pieces. We were having conversations up until the book went to print about what is relevant here? What deserves to be in this volume? And I think what we've gotten is a collection that is true to the original, but is also this really special edition, speaking to the times. And then obviously for, in the next 10 years, someone can pick it up and who knows what they'll relate to then.
Thanks so much to the three of you for those wonderful comments and contextualizing of the project and a background on the work. So now it's a chance to hear some directly from the co-authors in a way of the writing. First from Cristina, a section in Spanish, and then from Sarah in English.
I was listening to the stories that both Sarah and Lauren were telling, and I had a couple of those, but perhaps I'll leave them for later, because we're full of those little details that make these works so endearing and meaningful. But well, I'll talk about that later if given a chance. So this is nonfiction. The title of this text is nonfiction in English. That's how it appears. It was translated as nonfiction, of course. Let's see. Dice que no es creyente, pero que le han pasado algunas cosas a últimas fechas que lo hacen dudar. Dice que no le creeré. Dice que no contará cuando le insisto que lo haga, pero que no está seguro. Y es entonces que entre cambio y cambio me mira por el espejo retrovisor y noto la diferencia. Beto es el taxista que siempre me lleva al aeropuerto cuando salgo de Tijuana. Desde que lo conozco, que ya tiene tiempo, insiste en que algún día terminaré escribiendo alguna de las historias que me cuenta, y me cuenta tantas. En las vueltas al aeropuerto he conocido a través de su voz un cierto submundo de la ciudad fronteriza que de otra manera no visito. Beto también trabaja mucho con las chicas de la zona y en alguna ocasión me tocó compartir servicio porque andaban, como me explicó, apurados. Esta vez es distinta. En lugar de empezar su relato con la algarabía que lo caracteriza, usualmente subiéndole al mismo tiempo el volumen al radio, me esconde la vista y hasta cierra las ventanillas del auto. En un momento o dos recordaré cómo, al subir, admiré lo limpio que estaba, lo bien que olía, lo inmaculado. Dice que la recogió, como a tantas otras, en una esquina cualquiera. Dice que sus largos cabellos cobrizos, sus ojos claros, su acento de las afueras. Dice que se trataba de una chica muy joven, de las que aseguran tener 20 cuando apenas andan rozando los 16 y por eso son bonitas de verdad. Dice que la chica recibió una llamada por teléfono y que todavía con el aparato sobre la oreja le indicó el destino final. Dice que ahí donde estaba, en el asiento delantero, se quitó el pants deportivo y se puso un vestido entallado, verde, en realidad encantador. Dice que el destino final era un hotel. Nunca antes me habían dado escalofrío las historias de Beto, pero esta, aún antes de conocerla del todo, me lo provoca. De repente tengo deseos de que guarde silencio, de repente tengo la esperanza de que algo pasará en la calle o en su cabeza y dejará de contarme lo que irremediablemente me cuenta. ¿Quién que haya vivido en México o el último sexenio no sabe ya el final? Dice que le pidió el número de teléfono para que al terminar su trabajo pasara por ella al mismo lugar. Dice que entre una cosa y otra se abrieron de capa y contaron lo que se puede contar en un servicio. Dice, y eso lo dice otra vez ensartando su mirada pesadumbrada, su mirada afectada por algo que justo en ese momento no sé si llamar metafísico en el espejo retrovisor. Dice que nunca le habló. Sé que todavía no llega el punto que realmente me quiere contar porque hace pausas cada vez más largas. Algo discutimos alguna vez sobre el papel del silencio, del espacio en blanco, en la construcción del suspenso. Mientras calla, veo los grandes espectaculares de la carretera. Dice que a la siguiente mañana supo todo por la televisión. Dice las palabras de siempre, encontrada muerta, asfixiada, cuerpo sin identificación. Dice que tuvo que responder preguntas en la estación de policía. Dice las palabras de siempre, sin identidad, sin familia, sin qué más. No sé si en ese momento después empieza la náusea. No sé en qué momento me percato de que apenas unos días atrás leí palabras similares respecto a un poeta y traductor cuyo crimen permanece sin esclarecimiento alguno, atado de pies y manos, cinta canela en la cabeza, golpe o disparo de gracia. Cada vez están más cerca. Me digo, mientras quito la mano instintivamente del respaldo del asiento donde se había cambiado de ropa la muchacha. Dice que otro día, un día también de entre semana, le volvió a pasar algo parecido. Dice que esto es lo que no le creeré. Dice, abriendo los ojos pero manteniéndolos paradójicamente sombríos, que cuando la chica joven se subió al auto iba ya contestando una llamada. Dice que respiró profundo y dudó. Dice que luego, envalentonado o comprometido, en todo caso fuera de sí, le contó lo que le había pasado a la otra chica para convencerla de que no fuera sola a cumplir con una cita de trabajo a un hotel. Dice que le dijo, era una chica tan joven como tú. Dice que en ese momento la muchacha nueva se quedó callada y le hizo preguntas. Dice que al final, cari acontecida, pero sin derramar lágrima alguna, le dijo que era su hermana. Dice que entonces marcó un número y en voz muy baja le dio la noticia a su madre. Dice que dijo, ya sé dónde está mi hermana. ¿Cuáles son las probabilidades reales? Me pregunta como si yo supiera. ¿Puedo o no puedo ver claramente la intervención de algo más allá de nuestra comprensión habitual? Insiste. No sé qué pensar, ni de la conversión religiosa que me anuncia, ni del paisaje que gris se desdobla en polvo y ruido del otro lado de la ventanilla. Qué íntima es a veces la tristeza social. Dice Carlos Beristain, sociólogo y médico, perito de la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, que la violencia en México ha alcanzado los grados de la catástrofe. También dice que el legado de esta violencia impactará al menos 2 generaciones enteras. Los duelos, la rabia, la impotencia.
All right, and I'll read the English. All right. He says he isn't a believer, but that some things have happened to him recently that are making him reconsider. He says, I won't even believe him. After I insist, he says he'll tell me, but that he still isn't sure. And that's when, between one turn and the next, he looks at me in the rearview mirror and I can see a difference in his gaze. Beto is a taxi driver who always takes me to the airport when I'm leaving Tijuana. As long as I've known him, which has been for quite a while, he insists that one day I will end up writing one of the stories he tells me, and he tells me so many. On our trips to the airport, I've become familiar, through his voice, with a certain underworld of this border town that I otherwise would never have experienced. Beto also works a lot with the women in Tijuana's red light district, and once I shared a ride with a few, because, as he explained to me, they were in a rush. And if you don't mind, this time is different. Instead of beginning the story by making his characteristic racket, he usually turns up the volume on the radio as he starts talking. He avoids my gaze and even rolls up the car windows. In a moment or two, I'll remember how, upon climbing into the car, I admired how clean it was, how good it smelled, its immaculateness. He says he picked her up, like so many others, on your average street corner. He says she had long copper hair, blue eyes, and spoke with an accent from southern Mexico. He says she was a young girl, the kind who claims they're 20 when they're barely 16, and that's why they're so stunning. He says the girl received a call and that, with the phone still at her ear, she told him where she was headed. He says that there, in the back seat where I was sitting, she took off her sweatpants and put on a tight dress, green, quite pretty. He says her final destination was a hotel. Beto's stories have never given me chills before, but this one, even before hearing the ending, already makes me shudder. Suddenly, I want him to be quiet. Suddenly, I hope that something will happen on the road or in his head that will make him stop telling me what I know is inevitable and what he is inevitably going to tell me. Who has lived in Mexico for the last 6 decades and doesn't already know the ending to this story? He says she asked for his phone number so that after her job was done, he could pick her up at the same place. He says between one thing and another, they broke the ice and told each other as much as they could about themselves in one ride. He tells me this while fixing me with his troubled gaze in the rearview mirror, his eyes affected by something that in the moment I could perhaps call metaphysical. He says she never called him back. I know he hasn't yet reached the point in his story that he really wants to share because he kept pausing for increasingly long periods of time. We discussed this once before, something about the role of silence, of empty space in the construction of suspense. While he's quiet, I watch huge billboards pass by. He says the next morning he learned what happened while watching television. He repeats the same words we always hear: found dead, strangled, unidentified body. He says he had to answer questions at the police station. And he says the same words as always: no identity, no family, nothing at all. I don't know if it's at that moment, this moment, or later that the nausea starts. I don't know at what moment I realized that just a few days ago, I read similar words about a poet and translator whose crime is still unclear. His hands and feet bound, packing tape around his head, the final blow or shot. They keep getting closer, I tell myself, as I instinctively move my hand from the seat where the girl changed her clothes. He says another day, also a weekday, something similar happened to him. He says this is the part I won't believe. He says, opening his eyes wide, even though they maintain a paradoxically somber look. This time, when the girl got in the car, she was already on the phone. He says she sighed deeply and hesitated. He says, emboldened or concerned, out of his element either way, he told her what happened to the other girl to try and convince her not to go to the hotel alone. He says he told her, that girl was just as young as you. He says right at that moment, she sat there speechless, as if struck by something divine. And then she began to ask questions. He says, despondent yet not shedding a single tear, that she told him the girl was her sister. He says she then dialed a number and in a quiet voice, quiet as a mouse, she told her mother the news. He says, she said, now I know where my sister is. What are the chances? He asks me, as if I know. Can I not clearly see the intervention of something beyond human understanding? He insists. I don't know what to think about his religious conversion or of the gray landscape that unfolds into dust and noise on the other side of the window. Socialist sadness is so intimate sometimes, and intimacy can be so sad. Carlos Beristain, sociologist, doctor, and specialist for the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, says that violence in Mexico has reached a catastrophic level. He also says that the legacy of the violence will impact, at the very least, entire generations. The pain, the rage, the impotence.
Very powerful reading from both of you. I think give everyone 10 seconds or so to sit with it, and then I'd love to hear if you three have questions or comments that each other's readings and discussions raise, if you'd like to speak to those next. Yeah. So if Lauren or Cristina or Sarah, if you would have any questions for each other. So I think at this point we'll have the three of you speak to each other, and then we have some prepared questions. But it looks like Oswaldo has a question, and so maybe in about 20 minutes or so, we'll transition to questions from the audience and from other members of the Zoom call.
Can I go ahead and ask something?
Actually, yeah, sure. Go ahead, Osvaldo, and then we'll
No,
go to those three.
Just to get it rolling, I'm wondering, Sarah, if you could talk about the complexities of trying to translate this piece and how it worked out. Like, what was the most challenging part for you as a translator, and to convey that lyrical sense that we get in the original Spanish.
Yeah, and I think actually somebody might have already spoken to this in the chat, but I think it was that sense of repetition. And I felt it even more reading it here a second time, especially after listening to the Spanish, that repetition of the dice in this structure, and then the he says, that I think that's kind of functioned as an anchor to maintain the lyrical repetition of the piece. I'm trying to think of like details from it. I think I'll start with that, with the repetition of the he says. I remember with Lauren kind of teasing out some of the sentences that felt a little bit twisted in the English. But yeah.
It was a really unique challenge with this book because, for example, with Iliad Crest, we had a very distinctive narrator and who had a voice, and we followed this narrator through changes, but from start to finish, more or less. And with this collection, this piece, I can think of other ones we were just discussing earlier, like The Longest Sunday, where honestly, they're emotional sucker punches. Like you do need that 10 seconds at least at the end to really sit with what you're reading. And they come from a really personal place from Cristina. They come from personal experience where she's in the car with someone. She's across the room from a mother who lost her sons. And we have pieces like that. And then we also have more academic pieces. We have poetry as well. More journalistic reportage. And so we have these sort of moments where we can have tone that's more like, like someone's talking to you in a cab. And then other things we can get really theoretical. And so I think that always kept me on my toes for sure. And Sarah, you did such a phenomenal job in the translation.
Yeah, there was definitely at the start of each essay, I remember there's an adjustment period. Like, okay, what kind of voice tone do we need for this essay, especially as it jumps around. And I remember I got to The Longest Sunday kind of later in that first pass of translation, and that one, the topic is so complicated and so painful, and that's the one where Cristina is there with a mother who's lost her two sons, and the story is tragic and sad, but the writing there felt much more kind of narrative and almost definitely was not the voice from Iliad Crest, but got a little bit more into that sort of narrative prose style. And it felt almost like a relief to kind of get into that writing style compared to some of the more maybe analytical pieces. But yeah, there was a shifting that had to take place with each essay. And I think we also kind of probably polished that too in the editing process.
Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about that, the editing process, because it was not only the work with each one of these essays, but once we got the original book translated into English, then we had to discuss how to arrange these pieces to better communicate with an English-speaking audience all these many years afterwards, right? And so just putting all these pieces together and arguing for this arrangement of chapters or this other arrangement of chapters, it was just, to me, it was not only interesting, it just, it gave me the sensation, which translation usually does with me, that I was gifted a different book. So I was, perhaps some people might complain about, finding themselves with a totally different book once it gets translated. To me, this is such a relief. So the book has gone through a process So a process that turns it into something that obviously it resembles, it is anchored, so to speak, in the original, but it has become a completely different animal. And in some cases, this has helped to, with other book, with the, for example, with the Tiger Syndrome, a book that was not read in Mexico in its original in Spanish as a book of, what was it, as a horror story. It was read as such once the translation was available in English. And I think the same, that kind of transgression comes with this deep, meticulous work of the translator. And I'm just thrilled to see in how many ways, in how many directions one single word can travel with all the care and all these accompaniment, you know, by both the editor, in this case Lauren, and then the translator. So it's a continuous conversation, and one that I don't think is just gonna end right here. I don't know if we're gonna be translating these, adding some more chapters later. We never know what might happen in the future. But in any case, the last time we did a reading, remember, Sarah, that I usually, when I'm reading some of my works, I change words as I read, just because once I'm in that specific moment, I'm thinking, no, this noun is not working that well, or this other one sounds better right now. So I do that usually in my readings. But then I was reading one of the pieces of Grieving in English, and I started to do that. And then when I was done, I was like, oh my gosh, what did I do? This is not only my work. I cannot just do that. I mean, this is a translation that we were working in this process, and I was so concerned that Sarah might have been offended by this process. And then I realized that I didn't even make as many changes as I thought. It was just a couple of words. And Sarah, as you can see her just nodding right now, is like, okay, you know, whatever. We're still, just to tell you that translation is such it's a lively process. It's something that is unceasing, and it's a continuation. And we are all always pitching in, and the change of context, it also reshapes the feeling for words, and how certain echoes might reverberate better with other kinds of endings and rhythms and all that kind of thing. And so it doesn't end when it appears to be ending. And I'm just grateful for that. I mean, that continuation, that possibility of, in a way, almost like a resurrection. So I'm just grateful for that.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, speaking of resurrection, I think that moment of reading, was it? I forget. I'm blanking on the title, but that piece, I think that speaks to the living nature of writing. That just because something we can get to a published version of a translation or a piece of writing, but I think that the writing is constantly in transformation and in evolution. And I think your writing in particular, that I think you do I love the way that you're writing. You're kind of constantly rethinking and continuing to work with pieces of writing, whether that be through translation or through readings or through different pieces of writing.
Yeah. Well, in fact, translation allows me to do something that I always wanted to do, which was to totally transform my certain pieces of writing. I've been trying to get my editors and people to change the titles of my books. They are not buying it. But I'm trying.
We did have that conversation, I think, with the Iliac Crest.
Yeah.
Briefly.
Yeah. I was offering like, I don't know, like 4 different titles. And I think Lauren was just always very precise and so wise in the final decision. I think it was not my initial take on it because it was kind of literal, and I wanted to take advantage of the translations to try a radically different title. But all in all, the selection that the final choice came to, for example, to emphasize the role of bones in the story, and you know, the fact that we're looking here at least at the possibility of that our characters, that the narrator and characters in the story are already dead and are using bones in order to decipher what had happened. As a possibility, I'm not saying that this is the only reading of the piece, but in any case, the fact that we chose that title helped me understand that process much clearly. And in fact, it came as a surprise when I was revising and going over the translation again and again.
I have a quick question, if that's okay, bringing it back to Grieving. Cristina, we've been talking about, you know, translation and feminism, and this translation as these living, breathing texts. And I've seen your words in action. I've seen them heal in the real world, not just on the page. And I would love it if you could speak briefly about The Claimant. In 2017, you were in New York and you had a class visit at Borough Manhattan Community College, and there had just been a shooting. And we still had the class, and you went and you came with this poem, which is this collage poem, and we basically used it to talk through this act of violence, which is the crux of this very book, which then we put together years later. And I think it's just a beautiful example, and to show that, like, the thesis of this book is something that we can take out into our activism and into the world.
Wow, Lauren, I'm just remembering that day. Yes, wow, that it was powerful indeed. It was a very small class at at a community college, wasn't it? Yes, yeah. And let me tell you something about that poem. I've been talking quite a lot about this concept of disappropriation as a way, an operation, a linguistic operation that allows our readers to be in touch with the source text, with the different source texts that have been used in the composition of this new text. And that's precisely the case of The Claimant. It is related, in fact, to the former piece that you both were talking about, The Longest Sunday. The tragedy, one of the many tragedies, but the one that this one refers to is the shooting that took place in Ciudad Juárez in Salvarcar, where Luz Maria Dávila lost her two sons. And I remember having, I was not in Ciudad Juárez, but I was reading the news, and I was so taken by the description that Sandra Rodriguez, a journalist, offered of the whole event, especially when by then President Calderón, what he did once he showed up in Ciudad Juárez, and what Luz Maria Dávila did, which was essentially to reclamarle, to make a claim, right? To force him to see what was happening in Ciudad Juárez and trying to force him to take action. And so I was taken by that. I wanted to write something about it, but her words were already so strong, and I didn't want to change anything of what she'd said. So what I proceeded to do was in a way to make a collage emphasizing what she had said and what Sandra Rodriguez had to say, the journalist, about the whole event. I was reading some López Velarde at that point with this beautiful early 20th century language. So I decided to incorporate some of that imagery, especially some of the adjectives, and a definition that was important too, that I found in Wikipedia. So there are some different layers of language. This poem, some of you might remember that there was a very massive mobilization back, I don't remember the exact date, perhaps Osvaldo, you're going to remember this, when help me, what is the name of the poet who organized that, led that massive demonstration?
Javier Sicilia.
Javier Sicilia, yeah. So Javier Sicilia organized that that demonstration, and some poets were there reading reading their works. I wasn't there, but a fellow writer, Ana Clavel, read the piece. And I thought that was so fitting. The fact that I didn't have to be there to read it, that this was a text that called for, in fact, other voices to go through that experience, right? And I think something similar happened in that classroom in New York, that we needed to bring the words that we were actually hearing, because the language that we are in contact with is just so powerful. Perhaps what we have to do is just to pay attention to create that listening space that will give words already uttered their weight, and how important and how relevant they are for the way in which we see ourselves and how we see others. And I think something of that sort, some sort of alchemy, some sort of connection, a healing connection took place in that room. I remember that we left that day just in a sense of no, but it was this acceleration in a way, because we were able to make that connection and to work the poem through that connection. So the words were not just there, mute, untouchable, but they were changing, they were reshaped according to the specific conditions in which we were living. And so that was, I think that's the power of writing when we're lucky, right? When we have all these conditions around. Writing has saved me so many times. Writing has given me doors into so many different homes and universes, in fact. And I'm just thrilled at times, and in disbelief many others, that whatever I write can help others to share this experience. But in any case, that's very much my aim. I would like to, I'm thinking less about telling a story and more about sharing an actual experience. And in doing so, I'm trying to work with language as this material being, so that some other person who gets in contact with that language might feel the actual material effects of experience. So when you were saying, Sarah, that translation gave you room, allow you not to pay that close attention to plot or character, and I was writing down, that's very much how I feel when I'm writing. So obviously we want to tell stories, and stories are powerful, and narratives of course allow us to transform entire situations. But I really think that as a writer, if what I want to share is an experience and not necessarily to convey specific meanings, but just having some other body just undergoing this tremendous material transformation, then you have to pay attention to the other aspects of language. And in that sense, I think that I've been writing as a translator, feeling as Sarah felt with translation, that you didn't have to pay as much attention to these other aspects, which granted I know are important. But once we get to this other side, I think the whole game gets very, very exciting, and that's an aspect that I truly, it's a challenge for me. I would lie if I say that it's just enjoyable, because sometimes it is not. But is it the true challenge is what writing, what is specific to writing in my way of seeing things.
That's wonderful. And that makes me think of one of the questions we discussed before, which is about sort of the concrete craft of trying to convey these emotions and these senses and these feelings from Spanish into English. And I'm wondering if there are particular words or phrases or sort of theoretical bundles of concepts that were particularly challenging to make into a bridge for that feeling to be conveyed, and how you work together as a team to negotiate the translation related to those moments in the text.
I think we have to talk about Estado sin entrañas.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say I have two, the Estado sin entrañas, and I think the title too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's, I think you bring it up first in the introduction to the piece, and then there's a whole essay on Estado sin entrañas, and it's this way of describing a state, the state of Mexico in the 21st century, in a way that conveys the lack of heart, the lack of body, or sort of real physical stake that the government takes in the people. And so, but then you also, and you do this a lot, is that you kind of pick in ways that are really interesting, but you'll pick a term and then play with it in a lot of different ways throughout a book. In the Iliac Crest, it was the word amparo, and this amparo that I remember going back to a lot. But here it was Estado sin entrañas, but then you kept playing with this idea of entrañable, desentrañable, and this trying to find a language for a lack of intimate relationship between the state and the people. And we struggled with that a lot, getting it into English. And I remember we came up with, I think my first suggestion was the heartless state, this idea of trying to find different organs that could also be, that we use in English to convey emotions. I think we decided it sounded too cheesy, the heartless state. And I think you came up with visceralist state, and that was a sort of I guess, suppose a neologism, right? Of playing with this idea of viscera and lack of viscera and these kind of visceral experiences. And it works differently, I think, than Estado sin entrañas does, but I think it gets at a similar idea.
Yeah, it's just such a complicated thing to translate. And I didn't realize that when I was writing it in Spanish, of course. But, you know, entraña as your guts, right? In Spanish, it's easy to move from entraña to entrañable, which is enduring. And so there is a relationship between a very specific part of the body and a temperament that you attach to that specific part of the body. It just so happened that entraña, the viscera, right, and entrañable is a very different emotional state, right? So entrañable is enduring, whereas to be visceral in English is a different kind of temperament, obviously, but it's the closest we could get in terms of having that specific part of the body and to attach a specific emotion to that. So we tried several more. I don't remember exactly how many, but at the end, I guess this viscera and viscerality and to be visceral kind of fulfilled that entraña, entrañable, desentrañar, right? As I was playing with in Spanish.
I tried gutless at one point, gutless state maybe, which didn't work either. But
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the other thorny, I think, challenging part was the title. Dolerse is a really hard verb to convey in English. I think we had to be in pain early on, which is just, it's clunky. And I'm trying to remember, there's something else between to be in pain, but
remember,
was that?
Another option was just pain.
Pain, and then I think we played around with suffering. I think we got into the present progressive, this kind of like ongoing experience of pain, but suffering didn't feel right either. And grieving, I think, is what we landed on as a way to kind of get a more passive experience of pain, or not a more active experience.
You're going to be happy with this, but the other day I was reading this beautiful book, amazingly intense book by Cristina Sharp, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, and one of the concepts that she's working with is the wake work. And I was thinking, man, I wish I would have read this book earlier, because that would have been a great title, Wake Work, right? Which I think is in any case is also embraced by Grieving, by an action that involves the work and in the wake work phrase, and the collectivity and the connection to others that grieving brings into being as well. It's just that the work is way more active, as you were saying. It's a little bit more intentional and a little bit more political too. So I was saying that you're going to be happy with this, Lauren, because we're not editing the work right now, and I'm not suggesting it right now. Let's change it. Let's try this other one right now.
Future edition.
Yeah, I was wondering, Lauren, what was your role as an editor in these conversations and discussions?
Well, luckily they had gotten the visceral estate down by the time I saw the draft. Oof. So that was off my plate. They did the heavy lifting there. And really, as an editor, when I'm going through translations, I'm providing line edits, but really I'm a fresh set of eyes. I think in this case, we're privileged to have the author really involved. A lot of our authors for translations maybe are deceased, or maybe are just really busy and have a lot of they have big, like newer works that are coming out, whatever. And so maybe I'm working most with the translator, which is true in this case, but then also having the author sweep in and say like, well, what are you doing there? Love it. So that I feel very privileged and lucky to have that experience. And so I'm a set of new eyes. And so I think for this particular book, because Grieving's dense, Grieving, you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to want to read it again, and you're going to get even more out of it the second and third times. I know I did. And so I'm a fresh set of eyes, and thinking about those voice issues, the rhythm. Sarah and I read passages aloud to each other over the phone. Do you remember that? I was like on my living room floor and we were just like reading to each other, getting that right. But then also, honestly, Sarah, I was going back to looking at my edits and I'm just laughing. I'm like, what's this mean? Is this a reference I'm supposed to get? I'm sorry. Woohoo! And really just, basically providing like, okay, maybe we have some American readers that aren't as familiar with this history or this figure. We didn't do the whole footnote route because we, at least at Feminist Press, we want our text to be pretty accessible, and there are citations and things provided. But I do believe that you should be able to pick up a book regardless of your education level and dive in. And so Sarah and we did sometimes decide to provide glosses in text, maybe just a clause or spell out an acronym, what have you, to maybe add a degree of clarity. Not all the time. This book doesn't spoon feed to you. And I think, we always want to maintain like an otherness to the text. I don't want to, polish it and make it sound like someone in New York wrote it, but finding kind of a middle ground. And so I think as an editor, I'm trying to go through thinking of rhythm and voice, and then also just flagging things that for me were confusing or unclear. And so Sarah, I was thinking of things that I learned, like the significance of like plaza throughout the book, or like even what mantas really meant. Oh my goodness, Cristina, you're probably like, oh my God. But like literally reading it 2 or 3 times. And then we were talking about order, seeing the connections, the foundations that Cristina theoretically builds at the start of the book, and seeing how that comes through in all of the pieces throughout. So that by the end of that book, when you're reading that final poem, speaking of repetition and rhythm, all of these concepts, maybe you didn't know who Juan Rulfo was before, all of these things are coming together and just really blowing open your consciousness, right? I learned so much, and I know all the readers of this book are going to learn a lot, and it's something I'm going to definitely revisit time and time again.
Remember, speaking of the order, I think we had a phone session in which I think we talked through what really each section was like really trying to do. I remember having a long conversation about that, and then trying to clearly state how each piece fits within that section, and rearranged it a lot. I was thinking too of glossing stuff. We had the buchonas. I remember, I think we did add a gloss to that. And there were a couple, the introduction, which is much more like historical. I think Cristina, you went back and added in additional like information and clarification on different figures.
Yeah, yes, I did that. And I was very conscious about the new context. Translation messes big time with time, right? And so I wanted to pay attention to my current scenarios. I was convinced that many of the issues that I was touching upon back then in 2011 really allowed us to see more clearly what we were going through a year or 2 years ago, and even today. So I was trying to facilitate, to bridge that connection. I tried to bring myself a little bit more into focus in that introduction as well, so that readers could understand why grieving was important to me, not only as an intellectual concern, but as a process that I had to go through, as many Mexicans, as many others have been have lost loved ones to violence. So I decided that this could be a good place. It's something that I didn't do in the Mexican edition, because I thought that was obvious, right? But since we were crossing borders and reaching a different audience, I thought that it was that this was a place that it could work well, just to manage that very intimate personal connection to the different layers of different languages and different ways of approaching in terms of distance, the same phenomena. After all, the phenomena is violence, and I was trying to approach violence in as many ways as possible, just to trying to find a way to disarticulate that, to unpack it, to read violence from our lives in a way. Mm-hmm.
To respond to the chat, we kept buchona actually, and we kept many Spanish terms. There were some things we just couldn't crack. And so we would keep a Spanish term, and we don't italicize things. We also at Feminist Press do publish bilingual texts. And so I think it was appropriate actually to keep a lot of Spanish. Oh, so what's the gloss? I have to pull up the page, Sarah, maybe you have it.
I got it already.
You have it.
And
there were some other things that we kept in Spanish as well, just because we felt like the resonance, it was just too important.
Yeah. So there are a couple instances of it. So the first instance, the English is Teresa Mendoza was just the girlfriend, not the buchona of Güero Dávila, blah, blah, blah. And then it came up again the next page. What we said was the so-called buchonas exist in the good old days and still do exist today. They are the beautiful, uneducated young women who accompany narco men to wild parties or in flashy new cars, wearing loud jewelry and flaunting their enviable bodies. A sort of trophy wife, though without the civil status included. That's what we landed on.
Mm.
It's a tough one. We had a lot of conversations about that.
Yes. Which I think also involved, I think I was texting somebody else too, asking.
Gotta crowdsource.
Yeah, we've gotten used to exchange WhatsApps, right? It's like, oh my gosh, it's right here, this word, exactly what it means, what is the context of that? And whatever I'm doing, it's always like, wow, that's very interesting. What did I mean by that? Or what does it mean exactly in this context? Yeah.
We're coming up to the 6:30 time. So we have another couple questions from the chat I wanted to get to. One is about horrorism and the rhythm of the text. And one final question from me that we discussed before is thinking about gender built into language, gendered logics to pronouns, for example. In English we have his, him. Now there's gender neutral pronouns, them and theirs. In Spanish it's much easier. You have su. But how sort of these questions of gender, gendered logics, gendered grammars in the language can be denaturalized, exposed, or troubled by the translation process. And then also this question about horrorism and the rhythm of the text.
I can speak quickly to the gendered question. Is that I don't know that's necessarily easier in Spanish. I think they're just different things that you have to keep in mind. Emma Ramadan has a really, really good translator's note to Angareta's Sphinx, in which that whole book is written in which two of the characters, it is never revealed grammatically what their gender is. And so Emma in the translator's note talks about the different strategies that were taken in French to avoid making any gender markers, leaving any gender markers, and then how in English she had to take a totally different strategy to that. And so I feel like maybe that's something that translation reveals, is how different languages embed grammar, gender into the grammar, sorry. And there are sometimes there can be challenges in Cristina's writing because frequently there will be characters written about in the third person that you don't know if they're male or female because there's no indicators in the Spanish. But because of the way in English we need pronouns, it can be tricky to translate those sometimes without knowing who the subject is. That's my short answer to that question.
And I think that was especially interesting with the Iliad Crest, where gender lines and gender identity is very much at the heart of the story. And so I remember that we had conversations about when to hide, how to cover, and what kind of passages would be better just to disclose more clearly or openly gender alliances or identities. And so it took quite a lot of energy just to go through that because it was so central. I mean, it's the heart of the story. Oops, I shouldn't say that. So you read it. Yeah. Okay.
Sarah, I remember in the Iliad Crest, the ocean, for example, I believe was gendered as she, her. And I think from the main character's perspective, it was just so interesting. And so I believe that was I don't know if it was a creative choice, a discussion process, but I remember that being, I was like, this is great. This adds a lot. And they don't even know it as you're reading it until the end. This is great.
You know, Emma Ramadan, I think she was translating the Marguerite Duras, got in touch with me about that because she was also translating something about the ocean. And I think Duras had been using the feminine pronoun. I was talking about the sea as feminine. And I think Emma was trying to figure out what to do about that in English. And then I think read that we had done that in the Iliad Crest and had called the ocean she. Yeah, and so she asked me about it. I was trying to remember. It must have been a choice I made very early on because I remember going back through all of our edits. To see
So I think very cool.
Yeah.
It is so interesting to me what you just said, Sarah, that you're in touch with other translators, discussing how they've been doing things in other books and with other authors, or historically how this has been approached by others. It makes me think about this, network of translators, all of them WhatsApping each other, throughout the years, trying to uncover ways of doing that together. This is just such a wonderful image. Yeah.
Honestly, I love following translators on Twitter because they'll be working on a book and they're like, what's a word for this? And you get this great thread of all these different ways of like how to translate a really specific term. Love that stuff.
Yeah, me too.
Speaking of those networks, I was going to mention this at the beginning and I forgot, but there are two other books of nonfiction works that came out in translation by Cristina this past year by 3 different translators. Is The Restless Dead that Robin Myers translated, and then La Castañeda, Insane Asylum, translated by Laura Canos. And that we've spoken previously about how it's so interesting that those 3 serendipitously came out within a couple months of each other and all were speaking directly to each other. I mean, Grieving and The Restless Dead they're almost sister books that kind of came from the same set of writing.
Now, can you imagine what it meant for me? Trying to work and revise 3 books more or less at the same time. I was going nuts. And then I was sometimes I was thinking, I revised this already. Why am I reading this again? And it was the same term, but in another context. Or it was just crazy. I was just so very glad when the 4 of us got together and did that reading. And it's like, okay, we are done now.
There's one question from Carolina Sanchez about the different parts and literary genders of the book, how they relate to each other, or do they build on violence from different registers, or do they have channels, hilos, that connect them? And Carolina, if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask the question in Spanish or in English too, that'd be perfectly all right, if I haven't explained it well.
Yes, thank you. First, thank you for this great conversation. It has been really amazing to hear to you from this. How did you work as a collective enriching this book. And it is like the same you were saying. I was curious. It is like a follow-up question about what Cristina was saying on how the book, the overall project. And I was curious, since you mentioned that there are all different literary genders, how are the different like parts of chapters related to each other from this, taking into account these different registers?
You want to talk about that, Lauren?
Sure, yeah, I think in general, Deleuze, the collection had all these different genres present in the book. And really what we did is we read for our edition and found, kind of thinking 10 years later, new audience, what was resonating today? Were things dated? And then, because we just mentioned, Cristina is incredibly prolific and has amazing, amazing essays, writing things all the time. And so there are all these different pieces, poems, essays, narratives that we added to the book, and then thinking about how it would flow all together. And so when you read this book, you don't necessarily have to read it cover to cover. You could just pick it up and say, oh, I feel like a poem, or I feel like this. But we did think about that with the genres from cover to cover, thinking about what is it like to read, this book cover to cover, and thinking of subject matter, but then also density and tone. And so kind of like what Sarah was saying, was almost like a break. So basically, if we have a really dense theoretical section, maybe after we're going to have something a little more narrative, a little more anecdotal and personal. And I think it's really important that we sort of bookend the project with poems. And we talked a lot about how to end the book as well. It's always, what's the last piece in the book going to be? And I think there's a lot of, like the piece we read today, there's a lot of heavy hitting material in this project, but ultimately it's a hopeful work because it represents this community. And I think the fact that the book came out during the pandemic, when we've been so isolated, and this premise of that you're never alone, even as a writer, and even during the pandemic, and even on your Zoom, we can connect through these different genres and pieces. And so I think the poetry as well, really bookending it, to me, has a lot of significance.
Yeah.
It also felt like different topics lent themselves to different kinds of writing as well, and kind of led to different genres. And I think there also, the variety comes from the fact that this is, I think even in Spanish, this was put together as a collection of pieces that had been written previously as part of newspaper columns or just different kinds of writing.
Yeah, in addition to that, to me, it was really important to create certain kind of juxtapositions that might allow that critical thing just to fire up. So what could I do? In what way? The question for me was, in what way could I arrange these pieces so that my reader goes through a critical process in his or her relationship with violence? How could I denaturalize that? How could I disarticulate that experience that appears so natural to us? And so it seems to me that juxtaposing these different genres indeed helps to that purpose. And so it's not only that we were looking at it in kind of like the narrative flow, right? So we needed peaks, and then we needed places where the reader might feel relaxed, and then we could challenge the reader in some other parts intellectually, and then we could allow some relaxations, the kinds of things that we're always very aware of in organizing books. But in addition to that, that is incredibly important, is this other thing: how to ignite critical thinking, how to create the space for that critical thinking to erupt right there. And I think those juxtapositions might help. We don't know. I mean, you will have you will be the one with the answer as a reader for that, but the intention is there.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Yes, thank you so much, Carolina, for your question. To Sarah, Cristina, and Lauren for your time, for your wonderful thoughts and your words and your collaboration. To everybody for participating in the event. And if anyone wants to have any closing words before we end the time, and I want to point as well, we have another event for the working group coming up on February 4th. The link is in the chat. But
I just wanted to say that now everybody knows why I adore Sarah and Lauren. You can see how brilliant, how generous, how tremendously wonderful they are. So I'm just thrilled that I've been able to work with them, and I hope we continue to do so in the future. So thank you.
The feeling is very mutual. I appreciate your generosity and collaboration and everything.
Likewise.
It's been wonderful. I will say I'm always happy to, feel free to reach out to me if anybody's ever interested in talking about translation or getting into translation. I'm more than happy to chat.
wonderful.
I can put my email in the chat.
Well, maybe if Sarah's doing that, we could all unmute and we could applaud. Try and do a virtual clapping. I don't know if it'll work or not.
Bravo.
Great. All right. And then I'll send this recording out to everybody who's registered. So if you want to come back and watch anything.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you so much.